There's a version of American history that gets told through battles and borders and political speeches. But there's another version, quieter, stranger, and in some ways more honest, that gets told through food. What people eat when they have no choice reveals everything about who they are. And the pioneers who pushed into the American West had very few choices indeed. What they came up with was resourceful, occasionally alarming, and consistently fascinating. We begin with something that wobbles. Calf's foot jelly was the frontier equivalent of a gelatin dessert, made long before any such thing existed in a package. The process began with the feet of a calf, which were boiled at length until the collagen in the bones and connective tissue dissolved into the cooking liquid. That gelatin-rich broth was then combined with beaten eggs, lemon juice, sugar, and spices, poured into a mold, and left to set. What emerged was a shimmering, quivering jelly that settlers genuinely looked forward to eating. Some recipes elevated it further, with white wine, whipped egg whites, and layers of additional seasoning. A Virginia recipe from the period called for crushed eggshells folded into the mix, a detail that speaks to just how seriously pioneers took the principle of wasting nothing. Mrs. J. Chadwick's 1853 cookbook treated the dish with full respect, walking readers through every stage, including straining the finished liquid through a flannel bag to clarify it before setting. The dish had savory relatives, too. A version called pitcha, made along similar lines, has never entirely disappeared and can still be found in certain traditional Jewish kitchens. The next time you spoon out a bowl of Jell-O, you're eating something with deep and unlikely roots. Coffee presented a different kind of problem. The beans that produced it were scarce and expensive across much of the frontier, yet settlers needed that morning ritual, the warmth, the routine, the mild stimulation, perhaps more out on the open plains than anywhere else. The solution, in at least one well-documented case, was sweet potato coffee. Settlers would cook and mash sweet potatoes, press them into flat cakes, incorporate some rye flour to give the mixture body, dry everything thoroughly, and then grind it down to a powder fine enough to brew. The result wasn't coffee in any strict sense, but it was warm. It had a mild depth of flavor, and when combined with a small amount of real coffee grounds, it stretched those precious beans considerably further. An 1861 Georgia newspaper published instructions explaining how this blended approach could produce 8 or 9 full cups of beverage from what would otherwise have made only 1 or 2. Practical, inventive, and born entirely from necessity. Skunk requires a certain willingness to set aside modern assumptions about what belongs on a plate. On the frontier, those assumptions were a luxury no one could afford. Skunks were common across the West. They were manageable to hunt, and they carried a legitimate amount of edible meat on their small frames. The single non-negotiable step in preparing one was removing the scent glands before cooking. Get that wrong, and the meal was ruined before it started. Get it right, and you had an animal that could be seasoned, roasted with root vegetables, and served as a genuine meal. A 1959 issue of Boy's Life magazine described the cooked meat as light and pleasantly flavored, comparing it favorably to other small game that settlers commonly ate. For people who had been walking for weeks with limited supplies, that was more than enough recommendation. Sheep sorrel pie solved the problem of no lemons with a plant most people would never think to eat. Sheep sorrel is a small, tart-leafed plant related to buckwheat, common enough across the frontier that settlers encountered it regularly without necessarily knowing what to do with it. Those who figured it out gathered the leaves, chopped them, and built them into a pie filling that delivered a bright, acidic flavor remarkably close to lemon. Baked into a proper crust, the result was tart enough to fool a hopeful palate into believing it was eating something citrusy. It wasn't a perfect imitation, but on the prairie, it was close enough to feel like a small victory. Vinegar pie worked on related logic. Apple cider vinegar was kept in nearly every pioneer household, primarily for preserving, cleaning, and treating minor ailments. At some point, a settler discovered that vinegar, combined with sugar and warming spices and poured into a pastry shell, produced a filling that was tangy and sweet in a way that reminded the tongue of fruit. It wasn't apple pie, but it gestured toward it, and that was sufficient. The dish never completely vanished. Contemporary cooks have revisited it, drawn by its unusual flavor and its historical character. It remains a small, honest reminder of what people could conjure from almost nothing. Acorn bread arrived through a similar process of adaptation. When wheat flour was unavailable, some settlers turned to what the surrounding landscape offered, and in wooded regions, that often meant acorns. The process required patience. The acorns had to be roasted first to neutralize their natural bitterness, then ground into a coarse flour. That flour produced bread that was dense and heavy rather than light, nothing like the risen wheat loaves settlers had grown up eating, but it was filling and genuinely nourishing. Indigenous communities had understood the value of acorn flour for generations before European settlers arrived. Those who learned or adopted the technique found it a reliable fallback when conventional supplies ran short. Bearhead cheese reflected the frontier commitment to using the complete animal without exception. When a bear was brought down, nothing edible was set aside. The head was processed by soaking the meat in brine, rinsing it clean, and then boiling it until the meat was tender and could be separated easily. That meat was then chopped, seasoned, pressed firmly into a mold, and sometimes finished with aspic, a savory gelatin, to bind it into a solid, sliceable form. The finished product kept well and traveled without difficulty, making it practical for long journeys or periods when hunting was poor. It was protein from a source that required effort to process, but cost nothing beyond that effort. Mountain oysters have one of the more misleading names in American food history. They are not seafood. They are the testicles of bull calves collected during the castration process that was routine on working cattle ranches. Cowboys who worked those ranches were practical people who disliked waste, and at some point, the discovery was made that these pieces, when cleaned, battered, and fried until crisp and golden, were actually quite good. The flavor is mild, the texture firm, and among those willing to try them without prejudice, the reaction was often positive. Mountain oysters became an established part of ranching culture and remain on the menu at certain Western restaurants, rodeos, and festivals today. They are genuinely edible and genuinely historical. Beef tea occupied an interesting position in the pioneer household, somewhere between food and medicine. Thin strips of salted beef were simmered slowly in water, and the resulting broth was strained until clear.
It was given primarily to those who were sick or recovering, to people whose appetite had failed, or to anyone who needed something restorative that wouldn't tax a weakened system. When beef wasn't available, the same approach was applied to lamb, chicken, or even vegetables. It required no special skill and minimal ingredients, and it provided real nourishment in an accessible form. Warmth and broth have comforted the unwell for as long as people have been sick, and beef tea was simply the frontier version of that instinct. Jackrabbits were fast and numerous and catchable, which made them a natural source of protein for settlers moving through open country. Their lean meat roasted well and could be prepared in several ways. The danger they posed was subtle and took time to understand.
Jackrabbit meat is so low in fat that a diet built heavily around it could trigger a condition later called rabbit starvation. Not actual starvation, but a form of protein toxicity that developed when the body received too much protein without sufficient fat or carbohydrates to balance it. Settlers in this condition would feel relentless hunger, even after eating, because the body was missing what it truly needed. It was a counterintuitive lesson that abundance of one thing could be just as dangerous as having nothing at all. Squirrels were smaller and more overlooked than the great game animals of the West, but they were present almost everywhere and catchable by hunters willing to develop the necessary patience and precision. When deer and buffalo were unavailable because of season, location, or simple bad luck, a few squirrels could provide the fresh meat that made the difference between a reasonable meal and another day of dried provisions.
Hunters learned specific techniques for taking them cleanly, including deliberately disturbing branches to knock a squirrel loose before shooting. Small game required small skills, but those skills were worth having. Frizzled beef was one of the more satisfying meals a trail cook could put together quickly. Dried beef went into a pan with milk, butter, and flour, and was cooked until the liquid thickened into a sauce that coated the meat. Served over toast, it was warm, filling, and flavorful enough to feel like real cooking rather than mere survival eating. The ingredients traveled well. Only the milk required any special attention, which made it practical for the trail. Later versions added onions or other vegetables, and the dish eventually evolved into something familiar to generations of soldiers who had their own name for it. Frying pan bread was a natural companion, a flatbread made from flour, baking powder, salt, and water, cooked in a dry skillet over open flame. Dense and plain on its own, it served as a base for whatever else was available and provided sustained energy through long and physical days. Hardtack was the ultimate in shelf stability. This flat, unleavened biscuit, made from flour, water, and occasionally a little salt, was baked until every trace of moisture was driven out, producing something so hard that biting into it unprepared was a genuine risk to the teeth. Hardtack had been feeding sailors on long voyages for centuries before pioneers encountered it, and its durability made it indispensable on the trail. The preparation ritual was well established. Soak it in water or coffee until it softened enough to eat, which also happened to displace any insects that had taken up residence inside during storage. Crumbled into soup, it added bulk. Fried in fat, it became almost good. Nobody ate hardtack because they wanted to. They ate it because it was there, and it kept. Salted pork was the protein that made long overland travel possible. Before mechanical refrigeration, salt was the only practical means of preserving meat for extended periods, and pork responded particularly well to the treatment. Fresh pork was packed densely in salt, sometimes also smoked, which pulled out moisture and prevented bacterial growth. Stored in barrels, it could remain edible for months under almost any travel conditions. On the trail, it went into everything: soups, stews, and the frying pan, often alongside hardtack or dried beans. The salt load was heavy, and the monotony of eating it daily was real. But when fresh game was scarce and the next settlement was weeks away, salted pork was the difference between eating and not. Dried fruits offered the vitamins and sweetness that a meat and grain diet badly lacked. Apples, peaches, and apricots were sliced and dried in the sun or in a slow oven until their moisture content dropped low enough to prevent spoilage. What remained was concentrated, intensely sweet, and almost indefinitely stable. Dried fruit could be eaten directly as a trail snack, stirred into porridge for breakfast, or rehydrated and folded into a simple pie on a day when someone had the time and inclination to bake. In a diet that could easily go weeks without anything fresh or sweet, that small addition mattered more than it might seem. Livestock accompanied many pioneer families precisely because of what they provided. A dairy cow on the Oregon Trail was extra work. It needed water, grazing time, and protection, but it produced fresh milk daily, and fresh milk could become butter, soft cheese, and buttermilk. These were flavors from home, from a previous life, from somewhere more settled and comfortable. Chickens gave eggs, not many and not always reliably, but enough to make a genuine difference in a family's nutrition and in the sense that daily life still contained small pleasures. Foraging extended the range of what was available to settlers willing to pay attention. Dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, wild purslane, nettles, clover, and wild garlic grew in many of the regions through which pioneers traveled or where they settled. These plants were nutritionally rich. Dandelion greens in particular are high in vitamins A and K, iron, and calcium, and free to anyone who could identify them. They added flavor and variety to soups and stews, served as salad greens in spring, and functioned in some cases as folk remedies for common ailments. Learning to forage required observation and accumulated knowledge, and that knowledge was taken seriously because it had practical consequences. Perpetual soup was less a recipe than a philosophy. A large pot was kept over low heat more or less continuously, and into it went whatever was available: meat bones, vegetable scraps, foraged herbs, leftover cooking water. As portions were ladled out and consumed, more ingredients went in to replace them. The broth never reset. It carried forward everything that had ever gone into it, deepening in complexity over days and weeks of continuous simmering. Waste was essentially eliminated. The pot was both pantry and stove, a constant source of warm, nourishing food that required attention but not much active effort. The concept has found a renewed audience among those interested in low-waste cooking, but for pioneers, it was simply the most sensible way to manage limited resources. Canning was the technology that finally gave pioneers a real alternative to salted meat and dried grain. Developed in the early 1800s, the method involved sealing food in airtight metal or glass containers and heating them to a temperature that destroyed the bacteria and enzymes responsible for spoilage. The contents could then remain safe and nutritious for a year or more with no further intervention.
For settlers heading into remote territory, this meant access to preserved vegetables, cooked meats, and fish in a form that actually retained flavor and nutritional value. Canned peas, corn, salmon, and beef joined the wagon alongside the hardtack and pork barrels, and meals became meaningfully more varied and balanced as a result. Nutritional deficiencies that had plagued earlier generations of settlers became less common. Canning did not make frontier life comfortable, but it made it considerably more sustainable, and it set the template for food preservation practices that continue to shape the way people stock their kitchens today. The frontier was not a pleasant place to be hungry, but the people who lived there were not people who accepted hunger without a fight.
They boiled hooves, dried sweet potatoes, roasted skunks, baked with acorns, and kept a pot simmering around the clock. They made pie from weeds, and coffee from roots, and jelly from what most people would have thrown away. That spirit of absolute refusal to waste or give up is as much a part of the frontier story as anything else, and it tastes better than you might expect.